Everyone, and welcome to the Wall Street Blockchain Alliance's Crypto Roundup. Today is Friday, October 13th. Ron Quaranta here with my dear co-hosts, David Brill and Josh Klayman. Before we begin, as usual, our usual disclaimers, please remember that nothing discussed is accounting, investment, legal, or tax advice. Josh, David, another eventful week. Good to see you both. Josh, I know you're on the road, but lots to cover, and I wanted to ask out of the gate, I haven't had the opportunity. Josh, did you hit the SBF trial again in downtown New York?
So I didn't have a chance to go back. I was there last week, but no, I didn't go this week. But I mean, from what we've seen from the press, it's just been one hit after another by Caroline Ellison, allegedly, against SBF.
Yep, I've been following it, and David, I would love your thoughts. And again, I know there's the soap opera of it, and we see that in kind of mainstream media in a way, but there really are the revelations in some of the ways that they did business. And I remember a year plus ago, the three of us were joking about, oh, look, a Google Doc of their cap table, for example. But then when you hear, David, things like 7 different balance sheets or books and records for different investors, you really start going beyond the, oh, shucks, he made big mistakes. That's by design. Am I misreading that, David? What were your thoughts?
No, look, I think that's by design. It's one thing to have different pitch decks for partnerships and different opportunities. It's another thing to have different financials for potential investors. Yeah. I think a lot of people are under the impression that maybe Terra Luna was sort of the big event that might have undermined their financial standing and led to what ultimately happened. But what I'm hearing anecdotally and reading, it feels like this was going on for quite a while.
Right.
And I think that's probably the most surprising thing that's come out of this, or one of the most surprising things. And I think also sort of the lack of, I don't want to say respect, but like a lack of understanding or appreciation for how traditional businesses raise money, and just sort of not following any of the rules, and just sort of doing it as they see fit and making things up as they went along.
Yeah.
In a way that's very different than I think what people perceived or understood them to be doing.
Yeah. And go ahead, Josh.
No, I was just going to say one of the other shocking events, or at least to my mind, I don't know if anything's shocking at this point, but was what I believe to have not been disclosed before about the alleged bribery.
Right.
I believe the Chinese official, right? I mean, some of these activities, I mean, it really does make one wonder. Well, let me step back for a second. I think so much obviously is hinging on the credibility of Caroline Ellison and how much the jury will believe her when she ultimately keeps saying, Sam told me to do it. Sam told me to do it. So,
the one thing I would say, Ron, and I'm curious to know what you think, is, at some point, somebody can tell you what to do, but like at some point, if you feel like you're crossing into a place you shouldn't be crossing, then you sort of need to, not sort of, you have to put your foot down and be like, we can't do these things. Like, I'll give you an example. If people want to onboard customers and they don't want to do the AML KYC, like not following OFAC is a very strict liability. It's very black and white.
Yeah.
These kind of activities may have started a little bit in the gray, but at some point they became, way past the gray. And so I just like the idea that, okay, so-and-so told me to do this and so-and-so told me to do that. At some point, educated people have to make choices.
Yeah, David, for a long time, I think people had this popular stream of consciousness around FTX and others in the space. These really smart kids, they're being given billions of dollars, and they're reinventing global financial markets. And they had enough money and expertise on staff to at least say, look, these are things you shouldn't do. But for me, it's a more fundamental question as well. And Josh, David, I'd love your opinion about whether or not I'm correct. There's this is what the law says, this is what regulation says, this is bad, don't do this. Then there's the moral aspect of this. Like, if you haven't been in financial services, by way of argument, for 20, 30 years, David, like you and I and Josh, for example, But if you're taking customers' money to do something else and you didn't tell those customers, that's a moral wrong. And that seems to be absent in some of the very things that SBF was doing. And again, presumption of innocence, I fully get it. But that seems to have been absent almost from day one as we read through some of the testimony. Am I kind of misperceiving it? Am I making it more of a moral conversation?
Well, here's how I think about it. There are certain things in our space where there are very valid interpretations. Like if you
Right.
look at what's going on with Ripple and Coinbase, there are two really distinct views, one the commission has and one that the projects or the exchanges have on how the laws apply. And clearly they're not easy to solve because none of them have, went to summary judgment and the cases have gone away. These are difficult, thoughtful issues that need to be resolved. But, when you're misappropriating funds or, and you're doing activities that are not consistent with what the business is supposed to be doing, or at least what people are told the business are going to do, that becomes problematic.
And is effective altruism an excuse? Right, because when you look through some of the reporting on this, and Josh, I know you were there, and I'd love to hear your perspectives. This idea that maybe some of this isn't great, but it's so important for the greater good, it is not an excuse. And did you? I don't know if you both saw how some of that reporting came out, but effective altruism now is suddenly a defense, and the argument should be it's not. Either of you have? I know you're both altruists. I just want to know about what your thoughts are.
So I haven't seen all the reporting on effective altruism that's just recently come out that you're referencing, but I did see the reporting where Caroline Ellison was saying, that I'm paraphrasing, but basically saying like Sam basically thought that it was all justified, right? Because it was achieving a greater goal. And so I guess my thought is, it's an interesting type of defense, right? Because is there the mental state, the mens rea to be, harming people? Does that matter? And I mean, of course it matters. Seems to be the answer, right? At least the moral answer. But what I would say is just stepping back for a moment, it's not like there were so many small steps or frankly big steps along the way. Like the whole choice of whether because allegedly FTX was having trouble getting a bank account, whether in fact it should use the bank account held by Alameda at Silvergate, with Alameda having been named in a particular way to be able to get bank accounts, right? To make it not seem to have anything to do with crypto or trading, right? And then to go from there to having your customer funds for FTX customers wired into that account in the name of Alameda. Then once you do get a bank account, right, not actually moving the funds necessarily out of that account, right, and just having an IOU account, these are all it's not just one decision. It's the whole mass of decisions. And I don't know enough personally about effective altruism to know the ins and outs of what it is, but
I don't think anyone does.
But I think it's important just to remember, just like we're not broad brush stroking, or we don't want people to say crypto is Sam Bankman-Fried and FTX. Alleged bad acts are alleged bad acts, and alleged fraud is alleged fraud.
Right. And for the audience, thank you again for joining us. If you have your questions, please enter them in the chat, either on LinkedIn Live or on Twitter. And for those of you who are wondering, Josh is not losing her voice. She is yet again on the road sharing her thought leadership. And again, I'm grateful for both of you being here. I still want to talk a little bit about the case that will continue for the next, I believe, several weeks as I understand it. And again, not being an attorney, I was really interested in the original premise that Sam Bankman-Fried's defense might be on advice of counsel. And both of you are attorneys, not particularly litigators, but how valid is that defense? And is that really what's playing out in what you're reading in the transcripts of what's happening in court? Any thoughts about that?
So I have a lot of thoughts about it. Some of them, and apologies if I'm not speaking loud enough, I'll try and speak louder.
Okay.
I think there's a lot of questions about whether you can rely on that kind of a defense, including, what kind of advice did you get? Did you vary at all from that advice? Did you give all material information necessary to the person giving that advice? Was it reasonable
Right.
to be relying on the advice? I think it remains to be seen whether this will actually be put at issue because, of course, then that waives privilege, right? Again, with the caveat that
Right.
not legal advice, not a
Yep.
litigator, etc. But I do think we're seeing some aspects of that being brought through by the defense, not just in the opening statement, but in some of the cross where and even when it's not specifically drawn out by the cross. When I was there in court the one day, people did say, I thought that this was okay. I thought that, yes, I knew that we were having these loans, allegedly, right? But I thought that those were legal. And I'm not a lawyer, right? Like this type of sentiment. That's not a direct quote.
Yeah.
So I do think that whether or not that actually is brought forward officially, so to speak, it is something where people are trying to use that. Even if they don't go so far to say I relied on counsel, they're using that gap to try and say I didn't have the mental state required by this crime.
Right. And Josh, it's not just mental state as well. Just to peel back the layers on that a little bit, and David, I'd love your thoughts. I think I'd read this blurb yesterday, and there's a lot of great reporting about the actual moment to moment that's happening in court. But one of the questions from defense to Caroline Ellison seemed to be, how did you know that Alameda was able to have an unlimited line? And again, paraphrasing, so forgive me in the audience if I'm missing something. And her response was, well, I assumed, again, I'm using the word assumed, paraphrasing, that Sam knew, that Sam approved it. So from a legal perspective, how tight of a line do you have to draw between I assumed or believed he approved it to prove he approved it? And again, I guess this is particularly a litigator's question, but and we'll have to get some of our litigator friends on in the next couple of weeks. But I would love your thoughts about that. It's easy to say one thing, but how do you prove that? No thoughts?
I just haven't been as close. There's been a lot
Yeah.
going on for me this week, so I haven't been as close to sort of that line of defense and inquiry. I just think broadly speaking, I think the counsel and the advice people get are really, it's based on what you give them. So whatever advice you get is really a lot of times based on the input that's given to
Yeah.
the person who's giving that advice. So I don't think it's fair to sort of just immediately throw the advice under the bus if material things weren't shared or were
Yeah.
by that party.
Yeah, and I think also if just looking at the testimony or thinking back on the testimony, a lot of what's been trying to be established by the prosecution is that Sam was very much aware. He might not have been actually writing the code, but allegedly he was the one that everyone checked in with. He was giving directions to everyone at all orders of the company. I mean, even with respect to, say, like, for example, I believe it's Alameda, where Sam allegedly owned 90% and Gary Wong owned, I believe, 10%, right, at one point at least. Right? Like this just making clear that even with his co-founder, allegedly, that Sam Bankman-Fried was the one calling the shots and that everything was done at his direction, including fixing bugs in many
Right.
instances. So
Right.
I think maybe that, while yes, I totally hear your point about saying I assumed he was aware or I assumed he had authorized it.
Yeah.
I think what the prosecution's trying to show is everything ultimately came up to him, and perhaps something that big. How would he not know? How would he
Right.
not have had a view?
Right. And, obviously,
Allegedly.
right. And obviously, we don't want to rehash the case. There's a lot of great real time streaming. I know, Josh, you've been, shout out to Laura Shin. You've been on the podcast there. You've had these conversations. I've seen others. I know CoinDesk is doing great work on this. I just want to ask one last question on this trial. And again, we'll probably be faced with this every week going forward for at least the next several weeks. In the past, the three of us have often spoken about, well, it's interesting to see how judges react. So when I remember in our SEC v. Coinbase conversations or SEC v. Ripple, we'd have conversations in our legal working group. And it was interesting to see how Judge Torres responded or Judge Rakoff. When you see the reporting about the SBF trial, one of the consistent themes I see is the judge, whose name escapes me, forgive me, the judge in the SBF case seems exasperated, paraphrasing, by defense counsel. And I wonder how relevant that is and why that's important. That's not necessarily a reflection of whether or not they're doing a good job or a bad job, or is it? Is it the line of questioning? Why would a judge be exasperated by defense counsel? And again, I know this is a litigated question.
But look, I think also you have to remember there's a difference between civil and criminal.
Right.
And, a lot of times, like in these civil trials, these issues are briefed. And a lot of the questions that, flow through and the testimony given, our legal analysis are based on these briefs. And they're not so much driven on, there are expert witness testimony, but it's not so much driven on personality or things of that nature. It's based on interpretation of the law and facts, that are at play. Whereas here, a lot of it is who's credible, who knew, who didn't know. And so I think it's a different line of questioning. And, if you try and ask somebody the same question 8 times to trip them up, it's different in a criminal setting or in a civil setting where, well, this is what this case said or how we interpret it. It's a different kind of question.
Right. Go ahead, Josh.
Having sat in the courtroom, what I would say is I agree with what's been reported. In certain instances, the judge did have the jury did wait until the jury was not present to be like, I'm really losing patience. But in other instances, the jury, I believe, was present. One of the things that was frustrating the judge was that it seemed the defense was rehashing what the prosecution had just gone over. And so that, I think, was important for the defense because they want to show, to get it in someone's head what happened, and then to be able to kind of attack, but by reestablishing what had been said. And I think I have to say, the judge did, I believe at the outset of the trial, say something like, look, I may say things to the lawyers and you shouldn't take it as something against the defense, for example, just because I might say something to the lawyer. But some of the comments were actually really, there was one point where the defense lawyer was asking a question about whether there was a question about familiarity with the Toyota Corolla and what that was. And the judge basically said, look, there isn't a single person in this courtroom who doesn't know what a Toyota Corolla is.
Right.
How does that, you have to think about, what is the jury thinking, and will this have an effect on the defendant?
Yep. Josh, David, good points. And again, we'll be covering this. And I always want to end these conversations about this trial with, everyone is given the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. Let's see where this case goes. There's more to talk about. So just on some of the other topics, in the midst of all of this, and everyone's shouting about SBF trial, and the usual naysayers are saying, see, this is all illicit activity and everyone's a fraudster. Of course, real work was happening behind the scenes. David, I'd love to chat with you a little bit. We don't have to go in depth because there's a lot there, but JP Morgan, of all organizations, just tokenized BlackRock shares and I believe leveraged it for collateral. Is this that kind of evolution that we're seeing, blockchain, not Bitcoin, or blockchain, not crypto? And David, are we approaching this point where financial services use blockchain and it just doesn't matter whether or not customers know it? What are your thoughts about that?
Well, think about a lot of the back office that goes on with securities and who's holding it, and whether a beneficial owner or who's holding it or who's transferring it. I don't think a lot of people now in financial services really focus on that too much. As long as the shares are in their account when they go to check their account, and that money, the fiat's in their account when they go to check it, that's what they care about. But look, I think we're seeing this transformation, and it's not surprising to me at all that this is going on. And we're seeing a transformation where banks are looking for ways to optimize things, so less friction, and this is a way to do it. So I think while the crypto narrative may be different with some folks, people realize the value of the technology, and you're seeing big players implementing it.
Yeah. No, David, thanks. And Josh, I know you've got a wide range of clients across different verticals and different focuses within the space. Are you seeing some kind of shift in where your clients are moving? And again, I know there's certain things you can't talk about, but are you seeing blockchain, not crypto, or what's the market dynamic from a lawyer's perspective?
So I think it probably varies jurisdiction by jurisdiction.
Hmm.
I mean, my understanding, again, I'm not a UK lawyer, but my understanding from some of my colleagues in the UK, for example, is that due to the UK's new crypto marketing rules,
Yeah.
that this is having an effect of having people generally now considering geo-blocking or otherwise blocking folks in the UK just at the outset. And we saw some warning letters that went out shortly after that took effect. But generally speaking, not looking at different jurisdictions, just
Mhm.
thinking about blockchain versus crypto and the like. I don't know if it's that one is being discouraged, but I definitely see a movement that we haven't seen in years
Hmm.
towards using the technology to do the kinds of things that I frankly thought we would have done a long time ago. And we've definitely seen certain kinds of issuances outside of the US that haven't yet occurred in the US. I think we will see them. And frankly, the use of blockchain as an infrastructure,
Yeah.
I think is something that we need to see more of and we are seeing more of.
Yeah, and that bears out, Josh. Thanks so much, both of you. If you both recall, several weeks ago we had our tokenization of real world assets event, and for those interested in the audience, you could look it up on our YouTube channel. But to your point, Josh, it was a really great conversation around the real world use cases, including real world assets that could be tokenized and leveraging blockchain. So it'll be interesting to see how that develops, and it'll be interesting to see the parallel tracks of how's crypto perceived in media versus whether or not blockchain is even recognized in media as evolving the markets that we operate in. There's a lot to cover, and I know we've only got 10 minutes or so, but I wanted to raise a couple other things real quickly. David, I'd love to go to you if we could on price action. I had a really interesting conversation with a colleague who was telling me, oh, S&P up 14 or 15 or 16%, whatever this year. So I figured, as is our want, I'd have to look at the charts, and crypto Bitcoin is up, regular BTC is up 61% year to date. So when we look at this price action, are we pricing in and I know we'll get to it later, things like ETFs? Are we pricing in court cases like the SBF court cases? And where do you see the market kind of, David, settling out? Again, nothing's investment advice, but you and I are market watchers for many, many years. I'd be interested in your perspectives on it.
So, look, I think a lot of people are waiting to see if the SEC appeals Grayscale's ruling, which
Yep. Midnight tonight.
the 45th day being Friday the 13th. I know that's funny for a whole host of reasons. But look, I think there haven't been a lot of catalysts in the crypto market, and this is sort of the last big catalyst for this year, I would say. The Ripple case is going to go into 2024. It doesn't seem like finality in the Coinbase case is coming soon,
Yeah.
although you never know what may happen. So I think when you look at what's going on a macro level, there's more, anytime there's more, where people are uncomfortable, if people aren't sure what's going to happen, people are moving away from risk assets. And we still see, we're probably going to have one more rate hike this year. So,
Yeah.
I think the market, if we don't see, an ETF approval, or if the government were to appeal Grayscale's ruling today, I could see a fairly sharp sell-off. But I think that people right now some people are tactically buying, and I think some people are holding off on buying,
Yeah.
waiting to get a better entry point.
Yeah. David, thanks. And Josh, I generally try not to pull you into these, hey, what do you think of the market prices conversations? But again, just given the broad reach of the conversations that you have, do you see colleagues or clients that are kind of concerned about this market action? Or is it like builders build, let's continue to build for the future?
I mean, I think it depends, right? But I do generally think the builders will build. I'm here right now at Wharton RegTech,
Yep.
that think tank, and certainly there are tons of ideas, tons of energy. It's Chatham House rules, so I clearly can't say what it's about. But there's so many new things on the horizon that I think, yeah, I think builders do build, and I think we will continue on. And again, not price action per se, but I do think it's interesting. I think I saw somewhere that was it Coinbase, someone had noted that they believe that the potential ETF approval is sort of priced in partially. I don't know if you guys saw that too, or if I'm
No, I think it was a
misremembering.
Coinbase report
Okay.
or commentary that noted that it was in some way priced in. And you do see these kind of reports from, I don't want to say TradFi, but certainly traditional finance firms. Like David, when we talk about things like investment management or fund management, I think the the target was $650 billion potentially in the next decade on crypto fund management. I'm probably way overstating that number. It might be a lot of money could potentially be part of crypto fund management. So we see this evolution. Go ahead, David.
No, I was just going to say, you can't underestimate the importance of the ETF for really one main reason is that it would give institutions an ability to buy because it would be a security. And although you have GBTC, which trades OTC, there are just a lot of people who want to have exposure, but don't want to have exposure in a crypto account. They want to have an exposure in that same Schwab, Bank of America, Merrill Lynch, whatever online account that they may use, they want to be able to buy it there. And so once we have this wrapper in place and people can go and maybe even have it in their retirements if they decide that, it'll make it much easier for lay people to buy crypto. And I think you'll see more volume and liquidity come into the market.
So let's play devil's advocate, right, though, David? Because is access to the retail market one of the reasons the SEC might not have approved spot Bitcoin ETFs previously, and how they might try to avoid approving them going forward? I know we've got a few hours, but what are your thoughts about that?
Well, look, you already have places where people can buy crypto legally. You have Coinbase, you have Kraken, you have a couple of other exchanges. So that, to me, that argument isn't as persuasive because there are already legal places where people can buy it. It's just an interesting, the commission's made arguments regarding price discovery and surveillance. And I think maybe at one point that was an issue, but I think if you're going to have futures products, really, it's very hard to get people to believe that you can't have a spot product. So,
yeah,
and I think the court felt the same way in their analysis with the Grayscale case.
Yep. Josh, go ahead.
Yeah, and I know like the regulators obviously usually focus on retail in a specific way, but I've always thought, behind the scenes, maybe it was, the large pension funds, investing, right? Where it's like mass amounts of money and where the investments are supposed to be made in very, quote, safe types of assets.
Right. No, Josh, good point. And David, to your point earlier, and I could be misremembering or I just don't know. And if anyone is watching, I'd love a response. But I don't know another product approved by the regulator where the future product is approved, but a spot of that product has not been approved. And if anyone could educate me, please do reach out to us. I'd love to learn. Go ahead, David.
The other thing is, the futures product is it's not an economical product. I don't want to. It's not something that a regular investor would want. I think they would really want exposure to the spot and not the futures. And it is unfortunate that this is the chain of events that's going on. But hopefully, we will see one next year. And I think many people hope and believe that will happen.
Yeah, and in general, futures are generally targeted either to institutions or fairly sophisticated investors. David, when you look at the role of the future and the excess cost associated with that, that's not really helpful to a retail investor who just wants to buy it through their brokerage account.
No, it's actually more costly to a retail investor and sort of runs counter to the idea of, allowing people exposure and doing it in a cost-efficient manner. So,
yeah.
We've all talked about this at length, but, I do think that will be an important moment for the ecosystem.
Yep. We've only got a few minutes. One last topic I want to raise, and then we'll wrap it up. Would love your thoughts on what the next week or two look like for both of you. Do we make anything about state regulators and their amicus briefs on behalf of the SEC? And in full disclosure and fairness, I haven't read the amicus briefs that some of them have submitted. But does this feel like the state regulators coming to the aid of the SEC? Have either of you had an opportunity to see this?
I have some very distinct views on it. I'll let Josh go first.
So I haven't read the briefs yet. I've looked at them, but I haven't read them through. I mean, to me, it doesn't surprise me.
Yeah.
Really, if we look at some of the enforcements, they often started, or not often, but sometimes they started at the state level. Like I believe Celsius started at the state level. I believe that also BlockFi started with state enforcement. And then the federal government, the SEC, entered into that settlement with them later.
Yep.
So I think it doesn't necessarily surprise me that they would be going to bat for the SEC.
David, have you parsed through your distinct thoughts about these, or should this be reserved for a happy hour in New York City?
No, look, I think it's been part of an enforcement playbook where the states and SEC have coordinated in some ways. I think the overwhelming amicus briefs that have been filed, have been in support of Coinbase and in support of Ripple. And I guess at some point the states felt that they should also weigh in. But I think ultimately, I've not looked at all of them, but I don't think any of them have really covered any new ground. I think maybe the volume of the industry's filings and the nature of the filings, I think some states may have felt compelled to weigh in. I mean, states have come out saying that they think staking is a security in a number of instances, and I think a number of us disagree with that line of analysis, and I think this will be another area where the courts will weigh in and sort of be the arbiter.
David, Josh, as always, it's a privilege. I learn from you both every time I see you. I just wanted to ask, and I know it's probably going to be a similar answer because every week the three of us say the same thing. We're just going to be reading and doing more research and looking at the marketplace. But Josh, what's your coming week looking like, and what are your thoughts about the next several days?
Well, as usual, I will be catching up on reading, including reading some amicus briefs. As I mentioned, I'm at Wharton RegTech now. I think early next week I'll be speaking in Canada, in Montreal. And then I have some travel coming up over the next couple of weeks. But really, I'm going to be glued to the reports from the SBF trial and really trying to see what happens with Grayscale. I mean, the things we've been discussing today, I think those are some of the biggest issues out there.
Great points, Josh. Thanks. David, I don't know what compound you're at today, David, but tell me what's your next week?
Well, I'll be in New York for a couple of days, catching up with some people. But I am watching the price. I do think that, will we see a reaction to the price of Bitcoin if Grayscale, if the SEC doesn't file an appeal? And if they do file an appeal the same way, what will the price action be? I really think when you're looking at like altcoins and Bitcoin right now, we are sort of hitting a place where if we see like another leg down, we could see, another 5 to 10% move down. So I think, there's a lot less volume over the weekend and more volatility. So I'm definitely going to be paying attention to that.
Same, David. A couple of things for me. I will be pouring a lovely Chianti and waiting till 11:59 p.m. this evening on the assumption the SEC may or may not submit regarding the Grayscale ETF. And we continue to do work. As you both know, you're both paneling at our Crypto Investor Summit Monday, October 23rd, live and in person in New York City. We're almost out of seats. Anyone who wants to join us, please drop us a note, info@WSBA.co, or you can check our posts on LinkedIn on the event. It's going to be a great conversation, great thought leadership. 2 hours of CLE, and everyone gets to have hors d'oeuvres and cocktails at the end, which is always great networking. But Josh, David, as always, a privilege. Great to see you both. Happy Friday the 13th, and we will chat again next week.
Thanks. Great seeing everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.